Okay, so now I'll introduce our speaker for this morning, Paulo Ribeiro. The title of his talk is Will Technology Save Us or Destroy Us? So, ready to go?
Can everybody hear me all right? Great. So I figured I'd start off today's talk with a joke, but I couldn't think of one. So I asked ChatGPT to write me a joke instead. And it said, why did the computer go to therapy? It had too many bits and bytes and couldn't process its feelings. So the comedians are safe for now. So a lot has changed in the last year since I was here previously. In fact, ChatGPT was still several weeks away from being released when I spoke here last. And certainly that made a huge difference. We have seen since then a massive amount of venture capital being poured into numerous generative AI companies, and a number of existing companies like Google and Microsoft have been sort of touting their own AI initiatives. Last time I was here, we were talking specifically about text-to-image generators, and those have continued to get more impressive and produce results with higher fidelity. And as a result, we have also seen a deluge on the internet of fake AI-generated photos. Some of you may have seen these. They made the news a few times. There was an example of Pope Francis, that people see the Pope Francis picture of him in this sort of ridiculous, puffy white coat, completely AI generated. And it's not that things like this couldn't have been made previously by humans using things like Photoshop. It's just that now people can just generate it in a second or 2 seconds. We also saw Ron DeSantis's campaign using AI-generated photos to attack Trump in ads, where they showed him hugging Anthony Fauci, I believe is what happened in the photo. Yes, there's been definitely a readiness to use AI-generated content in political attack ads. A number of online publications have started outsourcing low-priority articles to text-generating AI, even though there's well documented at this point that large language models have a tendency to what they call hallucinate, meaning just make things up, because they aren't actual minds. They don't understand the world in the way that a human understands the world. They are simply just taking a guess at what the next most probable word is going to be in a sentence, which means that it will just generate text. It doesn't really concern itself with whether that text is accurate or not. But despite that, many companies are more than happy to use it to turn out low quality content. Tech companies like Microsoft and Google are rushing to integrate large language models into various parts of their operations, again, despite these accuracy concerns. Artists and writers have launched a number of lawsuits against tech companies that have built their AI models on large data sets of copyrighted materials. We'll see how those court cases turn out. Based on what I'm hearing, it sounds like it's going to be kind of an uphill struggle for artists and writers to make the argument about these data sets, but probably we're going to see some decisions coming out that at least curtail some of these practices. There's also, in my field, in education, concerns over rampant cheating in education using large language models like ChatGPT. This is true from elementary school all the way up until graduate school. And there was one, and some people are using it in particularly terrible ways. There's an interesting example of a professor who used ChatGPT to input students' essays and ask ChatGPT if it wrote this essay, which of course, because ChatGPT hallucinates, it just said, sure, yes, I wrote this. And so the professor started flunking students left and right, and there was a whole big thing about that. And yeah, so terrible use of that technology. Another example was a lawyer. I don't know if anyone heard about this. The lawyer essentially used ChatGPT to write his brief for the court, and it included a whole bunch of completely fake court cases, and the judge did not take kindly to that at all. So yes, some very bad implementations of these tools. We've also seen large language models being brought up now in terms of the writer strikes going on now. There's a concern. I mean, definitely these tools are not ready to be writing screenplays and things like that, but that's something that's going to potentially be coming down the line in the next 5 years, even maybe. So people are trying to get out in front of that and trying to limit the ability for AI to be used for those purposes. I've also heard that to a limited degree, the auto workers striking now are concerned over automation in the auto industry as well. They're also concerned about EVs, which apparently will use less labor than building a combustion engine. And then beyond the world of generative AI, there's also a whole bunch of other technological issues that we have to concern ourselves with. So those include things like self-driving cars, aerial drones. I just saw the other day the FAA has cleared a company Zipline to be able to deploy a lot more aerial drones that it potentially is going to be using for things around delivery. And I've heard some good arguments for why that would actually be beneficial as opposed to using delivery trucks. It just tends to be more energy efficient and therefore potentially environmentally friendly, but does come with other downsides. Additive manufacturing, so things like 3D printing is another field that's becoming more and more sophisticated. Nanotechnology, geoengineering. So as the world continues to warm, people are raising issues about, you know, should we try scrubbing carbon from the atmosphere? What would be the potential knock-on effects of that? Another big one that I've been seeing in the news a lot lately is also CRISPR, gene editing. So, and you can actually buy an at-home CRISPR kit to do your own home gene editing. And that is fairly unregulated at this point. We also see brain-computer interfaces. So there's non-invasive forms like EEG and MRI, but we're also seeing implantable devices as well that potentially could have very important medical benefits, but there are a number of real ethical concerns with obviously attaching a human brain to a computer. So in today's talk, I didn't want to just simply focus on recapping what's happened over the past year. Things are moving too quickly and just didn't really seem like that would be particularly beneficial. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, you know, how have we dealt with these things in the past? And there's always a problem of relying on history to predict future events when it comes to technology, because exponential technological growth makes predictions from past events extremely difficult. You know, so like, for example, you know, I saw a point made recently that more time has passed between the construction of the Great Pyramids of Giza and the birth of Cleopatra than Cleopatra's death and today. And so if you were to plot that time out on a chart, you would see that technological growth would go up exponentially. So in all that time between the construction of the pyramids and Cleopatra's death, almost no change happened technologically, right? But then after her death to today, that line goes way up. And so it becomes very difficult to make predictions about what will happen in the future, because every time you're looking back on the line, you're always looking at a point where the curve is not nearly as steep as it is moving forward. But we can still look at how people have reacted to technologies historically and see how that might impact things moving forward. So I wanted to discuss a few bad ways about thinking about technology that I've seen people doing recently. So there are two forms of historical thinking that I wanted to talk about that I have a problem with. So the first one I call there was nothing before me. And so the idea here is that everything that's new to me is new to the world. One classic example of this is the kids aren't all right, right? You know, that oh, this generation today, you know, they're so degenerate, they're so lazy, they're so blah, blah, blah. we can find ancient Greek writers complaining about the same thing. We can go, every single generation has this issue. And if it were actually true, if each generation were actually worse than the one that came before it, we would all have gone completely feral by this point. I mean, it would be so a lot of things aren't really that new. And concerns about automation are something that are very old as well. I found examples going all the way back to ancient Rome. Vespasian, the Emperor Vespasian, was opposed to using machinery to moving columns to the Capitol Hill because he was afraid that it would displace workers and that they would riot. Elizabeth I rejected a patent for a stocking framing knitting machine. I don't exactly know what that is, over fear that it would generate unemployment and that would lead to political unrest. A number of European cities banned automatic loom designs in the 17th century. It wouldn't be until the 19th century when the Luddites would come along and in England and would engage in violence over the introduction of automatic looms there. It took that long, even though the technology had been around that long, there was real fear about introducing it, that it would produce exactly the kind of violent reaction that it ended up producing. And one of the things people forget about the Luddites is that that rebellion required so many British troops to put down that it was actually larger than the British military campaign in Spain to defeat Napoleon. And it only really ended once the British government started resorting to mass executions. They just started putting people up on the gallows and just killing them. And that's really what put down the rebellion. The Qing dynasty also, in the 19th century, resisted adopting European manufacturing methods, in part because they were afraid it would displace workers. In the 1930s, also, there was a lot of concern around technological unemployment because the Depression was going on and there was fear that technology might displace even more workers, and also that it had potentially been the cause of displacement of workers in the first place. We had seen a number of industries at that point where essentially new jobs had popped up and then within a few decades they were gone, right? So we had in the late 1800s the invention of the elevator. All of a sudden we have these people, elevator operators. And then we automated the process of, you can go and push the button yourself. Elevator operators are gone. We introduced the telephone. And so you had the switchboard operators. And they were around for a little bit. And then somebody invented an automatic switchboard. The invention of the automatic switchboard is kind of interesting, actually, because it was invented by a funeral home owner who was upset because the local switchboard was operated by the wife of the competing funeral home owner. And so she was routing all of the calls for him to her husband. And he said, no more of that. Just one of the things that's come up in my readings, because people are digging around for all sorts of interesting stories at this point. And this concern in the 1930s was not just in the United States. So one of the quotes I found was Alfred Hugenberg, a prominent member of the Nazi Party, proclaiming, quote, "Never again must the worker be replaced by a machine." In the 1960s, American philosopher Eric Hoffer said, quote, "A skilled population deprived of its sense of usefulness would be ideal setup for an American Hitler." So then the other side of bad historical takes is the idea that there's nothing new under the sun, that this has all happened before, we've seen it already. Thank you. A terrible example of this that I saw the other day, I was reading a piece about modern political polarization in the United States. And the person was saying, well, these things are cyclical. They come around, gets bad for a while, and then it gets better. And they said, for example, before the American Civil War, there was a lot of political polarization. So it's fine. And I was like, okay, the American Civil War, where 625,000 people died, the bloodiest war for Americans, including World War II, that one, you're saying that the political polarization that happened immediately before that war is a sign that these things are just cyclical and we don't have to worry about it. Okay. Another example going back to that is when it comes to technological unemployment is, the people say, well, we had these periods of jobs being displaced, but it worked out fine in the end. So there was a recent study that was published about phone operators. And when those switchboards started to be automated, They looked at how those phone operators did. And for the most part, they did just fine. They went into other fields and were able to get back on their feet without too much difficulty. But that being said, these were entry-level jobs that required no college education, right? That's not the situation today, right? People spend hundreds of thousands of dollars going to school for a particular profession, and now suddenly we say, well, sorry, that profession doesn't exist anymore. We automated it away, right? You've still got the debt. The debt doesn't just magically go away just because the job went away. So I think it's important to keep that in mind that yes, you can usually find some sort of parallel in the past to the things that we see today, but it's never quite the same. It's always a little bit different. I found a nice quote from Mark Twain. He said, history never repeats itself, but the kaleidoscopic combination of the pictures present often seem to be constructed out of the broken fragments of antique legends. Another problem I have that I've seen recently is comparing potential implementations of technology against an ideal and not the status quo. So I sort of look at this as the real trolley problem. So in the case of driverless vehicles, we've seen a lot of opposition to the idea of having self-driving cars. And one of the arguments that I've heard people saying is we need to teach self-driving cars how to essentially do the trolley problem, right? The trolley problem is this concept in philosophy where you have these two tracks and a trolley's barreling along, and you only have the ability to switch which track the trolley is going to go down. And on one track, there's one worker, and on another track, there's 5 workers, and it's currently going to kill the 5 workers. So do you pull the lever and have it go and kill the 1 worker? And they sort of present this as being the case with driverless cars. Does it hit the grandma who's crossing the street, or does it hit the baby in the baby carriage if it suddenly is careening out of control? But I would argue that there's a bigger trolley problem in terms of the whole thing here, which is that the evidence is getting increasingly good that driverless cars are outperforming human drivers. And some of the, there are a number of companies that are producing sort of low quality driverless vehicles. Tesla is one that has gotten in trouble for essentially promising driverless features that aren't really all that driverless. It's essentially a glorified cruise control. And that has led to a number of accidents. But there are other companies that truly have created autonomous vehicles. And they do still get into accidents. You want to know who caused 60% of the accidents they got into? The other human driver. So 40,000 people die every year because human drivers get into accidents. And so if we get to a point where potentially autonomous cars would kill half as many people, do we just say, well, sure, it's not perfect though. It's still going to be 20,000 people a year dead. So do we say, well, let's keep the old system where 40,000 people are dying because we don't want to go to the new system where 20,000 people will die, right? So there is a real dilemma there. There's also other issues where we're facing that same issue. Right now, there's increasingly being used algorithms in fields like bail setting and prison sentencing, which definitely, because they're built on very biased data sets, are continuing to make decisions largely on the basis of race. Not that the fields necessarily are directly taking race into consideration, but a lot of times zip code is essentially just their replacement for race in a lot of these algorithms. But if they're producing better results than a human judge would, what do we do? Is it better to just keep the humans and have them produce worse results that destroy more lives? Or do we use a new system that will still negatively impact some people, but less than before? So now that we've looked at some of the bad ways to think about these problems. Oh, sorry, I had one more issue. Another issue that I have is looking at these issues with analogies rather than comparisons. I was listening to Ezra Klein, his podcast, and he had on a speaker who essentially said, I'm going to offer you a comparison, not an analogy. And Ezra Klein said, oh, thank you so much. Like, so often I hear people give analogies. He says, and they're really bad for lots of different reasons. And I heard that and I said, yes, Thank you. Finally, someone is saying it. And so I'll give you an example of one of the issues that has come up recently in terms of tech, where I see a very bad analogy being applied. So there's a lot of concern about free speech these days. We see things like book bans happening. We see laws being passed that essentially limit what teachers are able to discuss in the classrooms. But we've also seen from the other side a lot of disinformation being removed from platforms and people being banned from platforms for spreading hate speech and disinformation. And so a lot of people have started saying, well, this is encroaching on people's free speech, right? I saw a high school friend posted recently a photo of, or a meme with a Nazi soldier with the swastika removed, and it was now a Facebook logo. And it said, you are a platform, not a publisher. It's not your responsibility to fact check us. Which, it's very strange to me to try to take the moral high ground that you should be able to lie with impunity. Nevertheless, one of the things that I will see people say a lot of times recently, because that issue of platform versus publisher is actually very specifically chosen language, because there's a legal distinction between those two things. And one of the problems that I see is people will essentially describe social media as just being the new digital public square, right? And that it should be regulated in the same way that malls are regulated. So a number of people here at Bergen, I know were involved in this, where essentially, because of car culture in this country, we more or less killed Main Street, and the mall became the new place where everyone was going. And the problem with malls is that they are privately owned. And so malls would frequently stop anybody who attempted to protest inside the mall, and they'd be escorted from the building by security. And a number of activists, including some people here at Bergen, worked to try to ensure that malls had to allow people to protest to a certain degree. And so now I see people on the other side who, for the most part, were against making malls have to allow people to protest, now saying, we need to apply that same reasoning to Facebook and Instagram and all these other social media platforms, because essentially they're just a digital version of the mall, except they're not just a digital version of the mall, all right? So when you write your opinion on Facebook, it is then sent to their servers where it is being stored. They then use their algorithms to determine how they're going to distribute that to all the other users. And that they have a whole infrastructure for doing that. They have all these people that they employ for doing that. And then if somebody shares it, you're even less involved with the process then. They're just sharing the content that you made, and it's going out to a whole bunch of other people. And all of this takes billions of dollars to operate, takes thousands of people to make it all work. And the only thing you contributed to the entire process is your dumb opinion. And so trying to say that social media platforms are just the new digital public square and they're just the new mall is essentially the same as saying that when you go to the mall to protest, not only does the mall have to let you protest, the employees have to drop what they're doing, take your pamphlets, start handing them out to everybody, Xerox more pamphlets if you need them. And no one's making that argument. It's completely ridiculous. And yet people will try to apply that same reasoning to social media platforms. It doesn't work. So now that we've looked at some terrible ways to think about emerging technological issues, let's look at some good ways. So one of the terms that I really like is something called infraethics. So a term coined by Luciano Floridi. And essentially, it analyzes how ethical different types of technologies are. It's sort of the infraethics means, the ethics that's built within the design of a technological artifact. We often hear people say, well, technology is neutral. It's about how people use it. That's the issue. But the problem is technologies are very rarely ever ethically neutral, right? Consider something like a butter knife versus a sword, okay? They're both blades, but one of them is really good for spreading butter on toast, and the other one's really good for killing people. And sure, I mean, I could probably use a sword to spread butter on toast. And I could probably use a butter knife to kill somebody. I mean, not me, but James Bond could. But they're clearly designed for two very different things and are going to be used in two very different ways. So saying that it's all up to the end user to determine how it's used and whether or not it's good or bad takes the designer completely out of the picture and really absolves them of any responsibility. And even if we suppose that some technologies actually are neutral in terms of how they could be applied, could a use-agnostic technology actually make it unethical? If you design something that could be used in any way, good or bad, and you don't design any safeguards, any safety rails on it to prevent it from being used in a bad way, does that make it unethical? Potentially. So some of the ways that technologists are thinking about these issues is one way is something called value-sensitive design. So technological artifacts should support the values of stakeholders rather than undermine or usurp them. All right. So a lot of times this gets used with things like smartphone apps, which definitely tech companies want you to be on as much as you possibly can be. They find all sorts of ways to keep you hooked up, to keep you engaged. And in that way is potentially undermining some of your own values about how you use your time and things like that. And so value-sensitive design is saying, how can we make technologies that integrate your, that enhance your values rather than restrict them? Value-sensitive design is also places a lot of emphasis on identifying stakeholders, who has a stake in this particular piece of technology, and then also looks at both direct and indirect stakeholders. It also encourages participatory design by necessitating research on stakeholder needs, attitudes, and values. So you actually go around and interview people. One example I heard recently was about how the Obama administration decided to create a website to allow people to easily search for colleges. They wanted to shop around for different colleges. And so they built this website and nobody used it. And so rather than just scrap the whole thing, they decided, let's go back to the drawing board. And when they went back to the drawing board, they found out that the people who had designed it in the first place never actually asked anybody what they wanted. So they had no idea what it was that people were looking for in a website that would let them shop around for colleges. So they sort of assumed that they could just take what Amazon was doing or what other companies were doing, and they could just drag and drop it and just recreate that experience. And when they actually talked to people, they found, no, this wasn't what people wanted at all. And they ended up designing something else from the ground up that was actually, it got much better reception. People actually did use it. And there is also concern as well with not only the life of a piece of technology, but also its afterlife. How will it be disposed of when it's done? Can it be recycled? Can it be, brought into a circular economy? This also ties into another form of thinking, which is called a capability approach, which is used a lot in development. This was developed by philosophers Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum. And so what this really focuses on is how do different policies enhance people's capabilities? And so that should essentially be the focus of what policymakers do, is enhance people's capabilities and also strive for equity of capability, to give everyone the ability to do similar things. And Nussbaum highlights 10 major areas of capability: life, so just actually being able to survive; bodily health; bodily integrity, so sense of autonomy, protection from unwanted violations; senses, imagination and thought; emotions, practical reason, the ability to think reasonably; affiliation, who you're interacting with, who your friends are; other species, so concern for other animals and the planet; play, the capability of being able to play; and material and political control over one's environment, the ability to interact in a democratic system, for example. And so technological artifacts concern human activity and typically either enhance or constrain human abilities. And then the last important concept here is systems thinking. So appreciating the cascading effects of design choices. Just because we build something that expands the capability of users doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't far-reaching negative effects that impact the values and capabilities of others. So we want to try to design solutions that get to the root of problems rather than target the most visible events in the system, right? So you can think of, for example, if you have a town and they're having problems with the drinking water, they get their water from the river and it turns out that the water's toxic, right? And then they look around and they see that upriver, there's a factory that's dumping toxic waste into the water, right? The solution is not at the pump. The solution's upriver at the factory, right? So it's trying to look at these big systems and seeing how they all interact with each other. There's a great book called Seeing Like a State. I definitely recommend people checking out. And it gives an example of one of these types of ways that policies can have sort of unintended consequences. Which was that in, I think, 18th century France, they passed a new tax law that was designed to determine how valuable a piece of property was based on the number of windows on the house. And so the tax assessor would go around and count all the windows on the house and then determine how much they had to pay in tax based on the number of windows. Well, what do you think happened when the next generation of houses started to be built? They just built fewer windows, same size house, it just had a lot less windows, which, you know, when your only source of ventilation is from the windows at that point, there's no AC, there's no, you know, anything like that. They probably made a lot more people sicker because they were trying to build around this tax law. Systems thinking can also be used to create regulations that are less draconian and coercive, that they might end up being if policymakers just try to legislate the immediate effects of a problem. So one example that I remember from a few years ago was during the occupation of Iraq, they were having an issue in one of these cities where every Friday after mosque, people were coming to the main town center and protesting, which was fine, except that the protesting almost always led to rioting. And that was causing significant damage to the city, loss of life. And it also meant that US troops were being sent in there and you know, having to use violence against the citizenry, which was making things even worse. And so some of the officials were looking at the surveillance footage of when these things were going on, and they noticed that a lot of the people during the early stages of the protest were buying food from the food vendors in the town square. So they tried a new approach. They just banned food in the town square. Everybody had to go outside the town square now in order to get food. And what they found was not that people stopped protesting, but people came, protested for an hour or two, got hungry, and went home. So there are ways that you can sort of find interesting solutions to problems. I'm not necessarily saying that everything about that is above board, but it is an example of how you can find solutions to problems that don't necessarily just go directly to the immediate event that occurs, the explosion, if you will. So if we applied that to something like text image generation, which has been a huge issue recently, we see that text image generation dramatically increases the capabilities of everyone, right? I mean, there's sort of this idea of it democratizing the production of high quality images that make real what are in people's imaginations. So used to require years of training or deep pockets to commission work that you can now do with a very simple subscription or just paying a few dollars to run stable diffusion. And so, some people would argue, well, that's giving people a lot more power than they had before, right? And it is to that degree. But it also reduces the overall costs for projects that require a lot of art, enabling smaller teams with smaller budgets to produce higher quality output. But of course, it also reduces the availability of work for artists. It also lowers the rates that they may get paid for the work that they would be producing, because now they're competing against something that is so much cheaper, even if it produces lower quality results. Also, the speed at which computers can generate images quickly crowds out human-made artwork in online searches. So this is definitely becoming a problem right now, where artists are finding that if they Google their own name, the top 20 search results are computer-generated images that they never made rather than their own artwork. Existing legal processes for the protection of creators' intellectual property are far too slow compared to the instantaneous results you can get from generating AI tools. Text image generators produce photographic images that are almost indistinguishable from real photos at this point, which was not true the last time we talked. At that point, the photos they were producing were not nearly as convincing, which then reduces other people's ability to have access to good quality information about their world. Fake photos can also sometimes depict real people in negative ways that they did not consent to, harming their sense of bodily autonomy, right? So that capability of bodily autonomy there. I just saw a news article today that was talking about the small village in Spain where someone had generated significant amounts of fake nude photos of a number of the teenage girls in town that was then circulating amongst the other students. So we're seeing problems like that emerge, right? And again, it's not that these things couldn't have been done before, but it would have taken somebody hours to do it in Photoshop where it takes them seconds to do it with an AI image generator. And in terms of adopting these different types of solutions, of course, there is the issue that companies often disregard these ethical considerations in the design process. I mean, just as we were starting to hear about all the times when ChatGPT and other large language models produce hallucinations that produces extremely inaccurate information, Microsoft decided to fire their entire AI ethics team in March, just, you know, coincidentally. So if companies don't practice ethical design, that invites regulation to force ethical design. But regulators often lag significantly behind technological development that is only likely to worsen as legislators get older and the pace of technological development accelerates. We currently have the oldest Congress in history, which, you know, has an effect on how connected they are to these issues. Tech companies also have extremely deep pockets to buy off legislators and other policymakers. So, in conclusion, we can have a future where the dull, dangerous, and undignified work is done by machines, where AI can help us make new technological discoveries, where common diseases and health disorders are a thing of the past, where new civic technologies enables us to engage with each other and society in more powerful ways, where scientific progress allows us to live more harmoniously with the planet that allows us all to flourish. Or we can have a future where billions of us scrape by on a planet hollowed out by extraction, living under the boot of a tiny elite enjoying near godlike power using AI and robots and genetic engineering to enforce an unchangeable status quo. Ultimately, it is not going to be the machines that decide our fate. Even if they do eventually wrest control away from us, we will arrive at that point through our own action or inaction. We might not be in the later chapters of the Book of Life. Maybe our creations will carry on our story for us someday. But for better or worse, we will write our last chapter ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a very interesting talk. Fascinating talk. So now it's time for Q&A. So I get started here with Gwen.
Thank you. I was looking forward to this talk because I am very, very concerned about the next presidential election or any election. The ability to manipulate information everywhere on ads and social media and everything else. Nobody will trust anything anymore, or they'll trust it and it's junk. You know, it's crap. I don't know how we can get through this in a way where we have an actual election that's based on real facts and real people. It's very scary. I really don't know what the solution to that is, but it's very threatening.
Yeah. So there's actually two sides to that. One is in which fake images and video, because video is also another factor as well, audio too, convinces people when it's not actually real. The other problem is when real stuff gets dismissed as fake. There was an example recently that I saw last night, which was that Tesla was being sued over something, and a statement that Elon Musk had made at one point on video was being used in the court case. And his team tried to argue, oh, that's just a deep fake. The judge wasn't having any of that. But they had absolutely no problem getting up in front of a judge and saying, oh, that was just manipulated. That wasn't real. That didn't actually happen. So yeah.
Somebody else in the yeah.
I wanted to know, with the rising of this new technology, what is being their offer for people who are older and need to catch up?
In terms of like getting information, learning. Yeah, I mean, there are a number of really good websites that talk about these issues. Ars Technica is one that I like to go to. It's ARSTECHNICA.com. Really good. Ars Technica. You just Google it, it'll come up, even if you spell it wrong. It's a really good source. I use them a lot. Technology Review, which is MIT's publication, has some really good stuff there. Wired.com also sometimes has some good stuff.
I know we have at least one person on Zoom, so
Yes, Teresa.
Teresa.
Hi, thanks, Paulo, for an interesting talk. You know, at the end, you said that humans will write the last chapter. I wish you would say a little bit more about that, because I feel that most of us really don't feel that we have any agency when it comes to AI. You know, most of us certainly don't have the knowledge or the wherewithal to even know where to begin to help shape where we're going.
Yeah, that is very true. Obviously, many times, a lot of us don't get to actually write what happens in history. But I meant in the sense that some humans, at least, will be able to write that last chapter whenever it comes. I'm not saying we are in the last chapter of humanity. But in terms of next steps, I think definitely being informed is important, of course, but I think also being in touch with your policymakers. I mean, they are already having hearings on these issues, and there was a lot of complaints about those hearings as well, because the hearings consisted almost entirely of tech company executives who came in and said what they were going to say, and very little of it was from people who are more critical, or people who are, you know, spent their lives learning about these topics, but have a different view from the tech companies. Those people were not invited to come to speak to these hearings. So definitely that is one thing we can do. We can put pressure on lawmakers to really take a more comprehensive view and to listen to a lot of those voices that they're maybe not listening to otherwise. Yeah, so I think those are some very powerful ways that we can get involved, is to do a lot of the stuff that you're doing already to try to be involved politically and just focus on these issues.
May I ask a follow-up question? If there are no questions in the room, could I ask a follow-up question?
There are actually
There
some
are.
questions, but
Okay, okay, thanks.
Who's going?
I'd like to revisit something about the period that led to the Civil War. I'm a proponent of a democratic society, yet democracy initially in America was a failure. It led, and not because there were a lot of things that were not anticipated, and even including the Bill of Rights. What wasn't anticipated was the greed and the control of the North over the South. The North had all the industry, and the South they had to pass things through the North. And the North controlled all the product development and the shipping to Europe. They literally made sort of slaves out of the Southerners. Now, they also controlled the slave trade, the North, not the South. But the South did use slaves, and one of the things that happened is that when the people from the North, there were a substantial number of people that didn't want the slave trade banned. They didn't want to see slavery changed. And the reason for that was that they profited from it. There was tremendous profit from it. And if this sounds familiar, they were afraid that if they released the slaves would come north and take all the jobs. Now, does that sound familiar when we talk about immigrants coming to this country? There are, everywhere I go, it's health wanted stuff. But we fear in terms of our policy that our jobs are going to be taken. And it's an irrational decision, but it is based on human greed, which doesn't change, or human lack of concern for the consequences of what they're doing in order to achieve or to accumulate wealth.
Well, I mean, that's true. Greed is old. I would certainly dispute certain parts of your description there of early American history, but we can talk about that offline. I don't think it's okay. That's fair. Next question. Next one.
I think it's going to be tricky for us to navigate. As you say, the tech companies, they're not motivated to make an ethical product. They're motivated to make a product that makes money, right?
Absolutely.
So our kind of sole protector here is going to be regulation. And I think that's going to be a tricky one. Teresa, I think you're right. The only thing we can do is vote, I guess, to put the people in there who are going to try and get ethics and values in there somewhere. Because I don't think there's any reason really for the tech companies to aim in that direction. There's they don't get any profit out of it.
Certainly in a lot of ways, although that being said, one of the great examples, one of the people who was mentioned that should have been invited to these hearings that Chuck Schumer held, unfortunately, I can't remember her name right now, but she's worked a lot in facial recognition technology, which is becoming a really big thing. And one of the issues in facial recognition technology is that a lot of it was trained off of basically just white male faces. I think they kind of just went around to all the different offices and said, hey, we're going to take a headshot, and then just fed that into the machine. But as a result, these facial recognition technologies were producing very inaccurate results for Black people and for women, and particularly Black women. And so they went to these tech companies and said, your technology is deeply flawed. And within a year, a lot of these tech companies had actually corrected a lot of those mistakes. And she said that it's still not perfect. There's still a lot of problems, but it is way better. In the course of just a year, the difference was absolutely staggering in terms of the performance of these technologies. Whether these technologies should be used at all is a whole other question, but they are responsive to some degree. They have all of these employees, many of whom are folks just like us, and there are a lot of internal conversations happening around these issues as well, and they want to be able to live in a free and just society as well, even though there are obviously people at the top who are just concerned about the bottom line.
I think we have time for one more question. I guess we'll go David online.
Oh, yeah, David.
Thanks. Thank you, Paulo. This is a really great talk and very illuminating. I just wanted to draw an analogy to another technology, which is bringing up exactly the same issues, and that's the gene editing. You were talking about CRISPR before. And so, of course, these are all exactly the same issues, just in terms of instead of computers taking over the world, having, the ability to modify human genetics and all of the issues that that raises. And I see it as exactly the same issues. I have no particular insight into the solutions. I share Teresa's question of what we can do about it, but I just wanted to draw that analogy.
Yep, definitely.
Okay, thank you again.
To learn more about us, visit our website, ethicalfocus.org, or email us at admin@ethicalfocus.org, and we'll get back to you. To make a donation, go to ethicalfocus.org/donate. Please follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and you can watch many of our past programs on our YouTube channel.